May 28, 1940. Reich Air Ministry, Berlin. Hermann Göring held the intelligence report between his fingers the way a man handles an insult. It described President Roosevelt's request to Congress, a demand so audacious it bordered on absurdity. The United States should build 50,000 aircraft a year. Göring scoffed. In his mind, America was a land of amateurs and daydreamers, incapable of sustained war production. Let them try, he told his staff. Let them attempt to turn their soft civilian factories into engines of war. They will learn that aircraft cannot be stamped like automobile fenders. But while Göring mocked, a revolution was already beginning in Detroit. There, a Danish immigrant named William Knudsen, who had walked away from a $300,000 salary to work for Roosevelt at $1 per year, was rallying the giants of American industry. The old automotive king understood something Göring did not. Mass production was not a skill, it was a culture, and America had lived in that culture for decades. Factories that had once built Buicks and Cadillacs were already being stripped down. Engineers were sketching jigs and dies for bombers. Production chiefs were rewriting manufacturing logic itself. By the time Göring finished sneering at Roosevelt's speech, Knudsen had already begun converting the nation's industrial bloodstream into something the world had never seen. Roosevelt's declaration on May 16th stunned even America's allies. The previous year, the nation had barely produced 3,000 military planes. Its Air Corps was a museum of obsolete aircraft. Yet FDR demanded a leap so enormous it seemed like fantasy, a 14-fold increase. But Knudsen believed it was possible, and when asked who could deliver such a miracle, Bernard Baruch gave the same name 3 times: Bill Knudsen. And so began the transformation that would decide the war. By the end of 1941, America was producing 2,000 aircraft every month. The arsenal of democracy was igniting. Factories expanded in every direction. Boeing dug into the soil of Seattle. Douglas Aircraft hired workers by the tens of thousands. Ford broke ground on a factory so massive it seemed like fiction, Willow Run, a mile-long assembly line that promised to turn out a bomber every hour. Germany had the head start, but America had the momentum. And the naive dismissal of that momentum would become one of Nazi Germany's most deadly mistakes. Inside the Reich, intelligence warnings were ignored. General Friedrich von Beutiker, a seasoned military attaché who actually understood American capacity, sent cables back to Berlin describing an industrial awakening of unimaginable scale. His reports were met not with concern, but contempt. Hitler dismissed America as a mongrel nation, racially impure and culturally incapable of modern war. Göring believed American labor was too soft. Nazi analysts interpreted the influx of women into factories as proof of desperation, not strength. Their blindness was total. They could not imagine a democracy outproducing a dictatorship. They couldn't conceive of a society where free citizens replaced slaves. They couldn't understand that a nation powered by choice might be more effective than one powered by fear. That blindness, born of arrogance, ideology, and racism, would cost Germany everything. By 1942, America was climbing toward production peaks that only one man in Berlin truly recognized, Göring himself. And with every new report, the laughter that once came easily began to fade. But by then, the machinery Knudsen had unleashed was too large to stop, too efficient to disrupt, and too determined to break under pressure. What Göring dismissed in 1940 would, within 4 years, bury the Luftwaffe under a flood of aluminum, engines, and innovation so vast it made Germany's entire air force look handcrafted by comparison. The clock had already started ticking. If the Nazi leadership had understood even a fraction of what was happening in Michigan, they would have stopped laughing. Because in April 1941, on an empty stretch of farmland west of Detroit, the Ford Motor Company began constructing a building that would become the beating heart of the production war, Willow Run. It would be the largest factory under a single roof anywhere on Earth. 3.5 million square feet. An assembly line 1 mile long. A bomber plant conceived with the same mentality that had once built Model Ts by the millions. Ford promised something openly ridiculous, a B-24 Liberator bomber rolling off the line every hour. at a time when most factories took a day to produce one. And at first, everything went wrong. Early bombers were disasters, so poorly assembled that they had to be completely rebuilt. Half the components failed inspection. Engineers despaired. Critics mocked the plant as Will It Run, instead of Willow Run. But failure did not slow the Americans, it motivated them. Ford's team broke the B-24 into sub-assemblies, reduced endless custom hand-fitting into standardized processes, and invented new tooling systems. They implemented hydraulic riveting, prefabricated wiring harnesses, and a production flow so efficient that visitors struggled to understand what they were seeing. Then suddenly the curve turned. By late 1943, Willow Run was building bombers faster than Germany built hopes. By December, 365 planes rolled out in a single month. By April 1944, the factory produced one bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day. One factory, one roof, 1 mile-long assembly line, outproducing the entire aviation industry of the Third Reich. German pilots sensed the change first. In North Africa, Major Johannes Steinhoff watched American squadrons grow from a minor nuisance to a relentless storm. He noted, with rising alarm, that there are more of them every day. German intelligence analysts charted the numbers, but Nazi ideology prevented them from accepting what the numbers meant. By 1944, it no longer mattered who was the better pilot. Germany was losing experienced fighters faster than they could train replacements. Big Week in February 1944 exposed the catastrophe. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft, and more importantly, many of its irreplaceable veterans. Meanwhile, America lost planes by the dozens, only to replace them within weeks. Eventually, German pilots took off knowing the odds were impossible. Major Heinz Bahr described a mission over Brunswick, 700 American bombers, and we were 8 fighters. It was hopeless. This wasn't a contest, it was mathematics. America was producing fighters and bombers by the tens of thousands. Germany was producing excuses. By the time the US hit its 1944 production peak, 96,270 aircraft in 1 year, Germany had finally realized the truth. They had misjudged not only American capability but the very nature of democratic industrial power. The Luftwaffe was already dying. It just didn't know it yet. If Nazi leaders had walked into an American aircraft factory in 1943, they would have sworn the world had turned upside down. Everything they believed about war, industry, and society would have collapsed on the spot. Because standing on those assembly floors was not a carefully selected elite, not a racially filtered workforce, not an army of slaves. It was ordinary Americans, housewives with tied-up hair, teenagers fresh out of school, grandmothers who had never held a rivet gun in their lives, immigrants who had fled dictatorships, black, white, Hispanic, Native American workers standing shoulder to shoulder. And most shocking of all to the Nazi mind, women by the hundreds of thousands. By 1943, women made up nearly 2/3 of the American aircraft industry. Over 300,000 of them were building bombers, fighters, engines, and instruments. Some had been sewing dresses months earlier, now they were stitching control surfaces for B-24 Liberators. Some had never touched heavy machinery, now they were riveting wings with astonishing precision, and they weren't filling space, they were excelling. Defect rates dropped, productivity climbed, inspections improved. At Douglas Aircraft, women inspectors reduced the defect rate from over 3% to less than 1%. Wiring harnesses, instrument panels, and detailed assembly work became faster and more reliable than anything slave labor could produce in Germany. Engineers redesigned tools to fit smaller hands and discovered that lighter pneumatic drills and easier workstations actually improved speed for everyone, men included. Back in Berlin, German intelligence officers saw photos of these working women and wrote them off as a sign of American collapse. They assumed desperation. They expected quality to plummet. They believed discipline could only come from authoritarian control. Instead, the numbers went the opposite direction. American production grew from thousands of aircraft a year into tens of thousands. Factories operated around the clock. Shifts rotated seamlessly. Workers trained each other. Problems were fixed overnight. Entire production lines adapted in days instead of months. Meanwhile, Germany sank deeper into industrial chaos. Skilled craftsmen, the backbone of German manufacturing, were drafted to the front. Factories replaced them with starving slave laborers who sabotaged components whenever possible. Production was pushed underground into tunnels, caves, and mines, where transportation bottlenecks made quality control nearly impossible. Sabotage was constant. Engines cracked. Tail assemblies failed. Electrical systems malfunctioned. And despite all the brutality, output kept falling. The metalwork complex alone used 60,000 slaves, 20,000 of whom died, yet it still produced fewer usable engines per month than Ford's Chicago plant, staffed by paid teenagers and mothers on rotating shifts. One system was fueled by fear, the other by purpose. One used chains. The other used cooperation. And only one of those systems can work at scale. American workers, unforced, uncoerced, united by choice, became the engine of a production miracle that Nazism could not comprehend. Germany had built its ideology on the belief that only a rigid, authoritarian society could produce strength. But in the end, the greatest industrial surge in history came from a free society run by ordinary people who simply decided they would not let tyranny win. As American factories roared to life, Germany began grasping for miracles. The Luftwaffe had once dominated European skies, but by 1943 that supremacy was slipping through its fingers faster than anyone in Berlin wanted to admit. The first major shock came from North Africa, where German pilots noticed something deeply unsettling. Every time they shot down an American plane, 2 more seemed to appear in its place. Then 4. Then entire formations big enough to stretch from horizon to horizon. What German pilots saw was just the surface of a transformation happening thousands of miles away. The United States was building airplanes so fast that losses no longer mattered. At a time when Germany was rationing metal, fuel, and even ammunition, America was reaching a point where it could lose 60 bombers in a single day and replace them within 2 weeks. Germany could not replace 60 experienced pilots in 2 years, let alone 60 aircraft in 14 days. This imbalance grew until it became a tidal wave sweeping across the European sky. The real breaking point came during what historians call Big Week, a 6-day air offensive in February 1944. The United States launched more than 3,500 bomber sorties, hammering the factories that kept the German Air Force alive. German fighters rose to meet them with extraordinary bravery, but bravery does not change mathematics. Between 260 and 350 German fighters were destroyed, many of them flown by veterans who had survived years of combat. These men were irreplaceable, but they were lost all the same. At the same time, American factories were producing over 2,000 fighters a month and training pilots in quantities Germany could no longer even dream of. By the summer of 1944, the air war had entered a phase where Germany's defeat was inevitable. American production wasn't just higher. It was accelerating. Factories were adding shifts, expanding footprints, adopting new techniques, and rolling out improved aircraft models faster than German intelligence could track. Boeing's Seattle plant was producing 16 B-17 seconds every single day. North American aviation was turning out 500 P-51 Mustangs monthly. Consolidated and Ford were pouring out B-24 Liberators in quantities so vast that Luftwaffe analysts simply refused to believe the numbers at first. And while the Americans were building modern planes in massive open-air factories with sunlight pouring through giant windows, Germany was burying its production underground. Slave laborers carved out tunnels, laid tracks, dragged machinery through caves, and assembled aircraft under conditions so brutal that thousands died. Even under ideal circumstances, underground production is slow, inefficient, and chaotic. Under Nazi circumstances, it was catastrophic. Quality collapsed, sabotage increased, entire shipments of engines or wings failed inspection. Meanwhile, American factories built by free workers improved quality year after year. Then came D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the sky over Normandy filled with nearly 12,000 Allied aircraft. Germany managed to launch barely 300. That ratio, nearly 36-1, wasn't a tactical imbalance. It was the final and undeniable proof that Germany had already lost the industrial war long before it lost the military one. After that day, German pilots described the sky as a metal storm. P-51 Mustangs appeared everywhere at once. American bombers hit targets in oil fields, rail yards, communication centers, and even underground factories with relentless frequency. Germany's aviation fuel evaporated. Training hours were cut until new pilots entered combat barely able to handle their aircraft. The Luftwaffe was collapsing in slow motion, crushed not by strategy, but by the weight of a production machine so vast that no dictatorship on earth could match it. Even Hitler began to understand, too late, what his generals had tried to warn him about for years. One of them, Rommel, summarized the situation bluntly before D-Day. He said that when the Americans came, they would come with such material power that no position could hold against them. He was right. It wasn't strategy or tactics that broke the Reich. It wasn't aces or generals. It was the factories, the workers, the assembly lines, the women riveting wings, the immigrants assembling engines, the teenagers tightening bolts. Germany believed the war would be won by superior soldiers. America proved it would be won by superior production. By the time the war reached its final phase, the truth was impossible for anyone to ignore, even inside Hitler's inner circle. The Luftwaffe was no longer an air force, it was a ghost. Factories were no longer factories, they were scattered tunnels powered by slave labor. German pilots went into battle with barely any fuel, barely any training, and almost no hope of surviving more than a few missions. And while Germany searched for miracle weapons to change the outcome, America continued flooding the world with aircraft in quantities beyond anything the Reich had imagined possible. The Me-262 jet was supposed to be the game-changer. It was fast, powerful, and terrifying in the hands of a skilled pilot. But even this technological marvel couldn't save Germany. They built just over 1,400 of them. Most never flew. Engines burned out in 10 hours. Materials were scarce. Sabotage was constant. And no matter how advanced the jet was, it could not touch the overwhelming mass of conventional aircraft the Allies sent up every single day. A few hundred jets simply couldn't fight 20,000 Allied aircraft. Meanwhile, America didn't stop innovating just because it was already winning. While Germany struggled to keep a few jets in the air, American engineers were already testing the P-80 Shooting Star. American factories were still expanding. Production lines were still improving. New models were still entering service. The United States had so much depth that it could experiment, fail, redesign, and still outproduce Germany 5-1. And the consequences showed up everywhere. Entire German cities were cut off. Supplies collapsed. The headache for German leadership became not fighting the enemy, but trying to coordinate anything at all without fuel, trucks, or aircraft. The entire German war machine was starving long before soldiers surrendered their rifles. By late 1944, German generals openly admitted what their ideology had prevented them from seeing earlier. They weren't fighting an enemy, they were fighting a continent-sized factory. When the war ended and the Nazi leadership found themselves in Allied custody, even their arrogance began to crack. Hermann Göring, once convinced that America was a weak industrial joke, now sat in interrogation rooms staring at production charts that made a mockery of everything he had believed. He fixated on Willow Run, the factory he used to laugh at. He kept asking how a single building could outproduce his entire air force. He kept recalculating the numbers as though the math might change. But the math had already written the ending. By the time of the Nuremberg trials, Göring no longer tried to deny what happened. He admitted, in his own words, that he had never imagined a nation could increase aircraft production 100-fold in 4 years. He admitted that Germany was defeated not by better soldiers, but by better factories. He admitted that America's ability to supply armies 5,000 miles away was something the Reich had never been capable of understanding, let alone matching. And in his final hours, shortly before taking his own life, Göring wrote that America's industrial power had sealed Germany's fate long before the first bomb fell on Berlin. That was the truth the Nazis never understood until it was too late. They believed supremacy came from ideology, discipline, and fear. America proved supremacy came from something else entirely, from free workers, from creativity, from voluntary cooperation, from the willingness of ordinary citizens to rise to extraordinary challenges. The key difference wasn't culture, it wasn't race, it wasn't even technology. It was freedom. Free people could innovate faster, solve problems quicker, work harder without being forced, build systems that scaled beyond anything authoritarian regimes could imagine. A dictatorship could command a factory to produce, but a democracy could inspire a nation to produce. That difference meant everything. By the time the war ended, American factories had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft. Germany had produced fewer than 100,000. And behind those numbers was the lesson the world still remembers today. The Allies didn't just win the war on the battlefield. They won it in the foundries, in the assembly lines, in the machine shops, in the drafting rooms. In the hands of workers who believed they were building something worth fighting for. The B-24 seconds rolling off Willow Run every hour weren't just machines. They were proof that a free society, when properly mobilized, becomes a force no dictatorship can match. Göring laughed at Roosevelt's demand for 50,000 planes a year. America responded by building twice that many, and reshaping the entire course of history. In the end, what destroyed the Third Reich wasn't a secret weapon or a brilliant tactic. It was a nation that the Nazis had dismissed as soft and weak. A nation whose true strength didn't come from conquest, but from creation. America won because it could make more, faster, and better, and because its people believed in the cause behind the work. The Industrial War was the decisive war, and democracy proved it could outbuild tyranny every single time. That is the legacy of the production miracle. A war won by rivets as surely as by bullets. A victory earned not only by soldiers, but by millions of workers whose hands shaped the arsenal that crushed fascism under a mountain of steel, aluminum, and unstoppable determination.